What thing more terrible than a town that turns its eyes from mercy? Here now. A wind with the rasp of old bones tore down the lane. The moon, a silver coin half-bitten, watched a knot of men whose shadows were knives. Beneath the hawthorn's black ribs a plan was whispered, to rid the fields of a wild thing whose mane the children called a comet and whose eyes kept the night. They had bound him with lawless paper and with purposed rope. The stallion must end. Who would stand between the kindly cruelty of the many and the single breath of one proud beast? Who but a boy hollowed by loss, whose hands know hunger better than hands know gold? He had no name the town would use. He kept instead a small carved horse with a broken ear, and a locket that smelled faintly of ashes. To him the wild horse was not monstrous, but a mirror. To him the horse's silence was kin. On that night, with the hawthorn leaves clapping like an audience, the magistrate's torch found the stallion, scarred across the flank, muzzle lined with old frost, fettered not by iron but by men's resentment. The town's breath tightened. The rope was pulled taut. The order was muttered. The boy listened from the gloom, a shadow that might vanish with the next gust. What could one ragged child do against a sentence sworn by 10 sober throats and the law that favored pennies over pulse? A hoof beat like a small drum, a sound that answered some ancient summons in the boy's heart. He rose not from courage but from a hunger that had learned to call itself daring. What he chose that night would break the ordinary world and set both boy and beast upon a road no neighbor could have foreseen. But which liberty or doom would come to meet them upon that lane? He was called by none. He carried only the husk of himself through the town's lesser alleys. In the small hours he would stand by the market where the fishwives left their scraps, and in the broad hours he would watch the parish bells fold the light into neat excuses for the wealthy. He kept his sleep beneath a collapsed cart by the orchard whose apples had the look of old coins, pocked, bruised dark, still sweet. He was clever with small things, the mending of broken crates, the trading of a story for a crust, but clever had not taught him to speak up at the council table. His wound was not shown in speech, but in the manner he avoided a certain corner of the town square, where laughter had once been his, and turned to ash. There was a seam in him that closed whenever other boys ran like the sun, whole and shining. It made him move softer so no one would hear the missing echo. They named him sometimes Sparrow, sometimes Nothing, always a thing made small. He liked the carved horse because it kept the shape of something proud. When he cradled its smooth flank, he could pretend hands had not abandoned him. Around his neck hung an old silver locket, dented, its hinge a fragile promise. He had found the locket in a ruined stable years ago, half buried in straw, its chain muddied. Since then, he had refused to let its face be separated from his chest. Occasionally, when wind and hunger allowed, he would open it and press the hollow space to his mouth and imagine a voice. He was a boy practiced in silence and in small salvations. The town of Ashford, for so the clustered cottages and crooked roofs were called by those who would answer. To the map, breathed by rules older than the boy's lifetime. The fields were counted by tithes and the horses by brands. Men measured worth in beasts and bread, in who could turn soil to profit and hide the rest under ledger. In such a ledger, a wild animal had no speech. Once a stallion ran free, he was a storm. A second storm made the men nervous, and nervous men make fences. The town's magistrate, a man with a jaw like a ledger's iron hinge, kept a list of things to be kept tidy. When the stallion began to appear near the orchards at dusk, a black silhouette at the edge of plowed fields, a gleam of eye in the hedgerows, the magistrate put his quill to work. The boy watched these matters from the orchard wall where lichen claimed the stone, and the air smelled faintly of old rot. He watched because he had nothing else to do, and because the stallion's passing left a trace in him like a remembered song. He had seen the beast once before, months earlier, when the horse thinned the air with its running and the boy's heart found a rhythm it had forgotten. The stallion's mane caught the late sun and looked like something on fire. He had not spoken in words then. He had simply watched and felt a recognition that was not memory alone but a stitch in the fabric of his own missing past. What such a stitch meant he could not yet say, but it kept him from sleeping at times when the moon hung thin and worried. Life for the boy was a collection of small rituals. Each morning he would rise when the bell tolled thrice, scavenging bread crusts, repairing rope, making small useful things to trade for a bowl of soup. He whistled sometimes, a half-tune he had invented that seemed to ask less and promise nothing. His hands knew how to soothe a nervous foal by the rhythm of breath and the placement of a palm. He had learned that from watching, from listening, from imitation. This quiet skill would later make the difference, though in the ordinary hours it served only to keep him from striking sparks of friendship. Where stones would be hurled, foreshadowed, in his pocket was the rusted horseshoe he had found, under the orchard hedgerow, pitted, with a mark like a crescent hammered into its heel. He kept it like a talisman, though he could not explain why. At odd times his fingers would find its edge and trace the crescent as if reading a map only he could see. Around the town talk gathered as it always does, complaints about lost harvests, whispers of a beast that chewed at fences, and murmurs that those who tamed wild things were the ones whom fortune favored. In a house on the hill the magistrate kept a ledger. In the lane below the boy kept his locket. Both would open to reveal truths that had long been kept in the folds of silence. The inciting hour arrived as the world sat in that thin place where dusk stands up and refuses to be dark. The stallion was discovered at the orchard's edge, not by a hunter's eye but by a child's frightened sob. A ladder of men came with torches because men with torches always feel closer to rightness. The beast stood tethered to a bent iron ring. Blood had crusted beneath a flank where a nameless injury had angled like a jagged promise. He bore a scar, a white crescent of healed flesh across his shoulder, as though someone had tried to write upon him and failed. Around his fetlock lay a chain, too short for his need, knotted by a hand that thought to teach obedience. The town had decided upon his fate, to cut the throat of the wild stallion at dawn, to show virtue in a public lesson. When Sparrow, called so sometimes by a woman who had given him stale bread, slipped from his shadowed shelter to see, he moved like a thing that had practiced disappearance. He watched the men who argued like coyotes about property and danger. He saw in their faces not hatred but calculation. He had no place to stand in the debate of men. Yet his heart pulled him toward the animal as though a thread had been found that ran from his chest to the stallion's. He did not know why. Perhaps it was the scar that echoed the crescent he carried in the horseshoe. Perhaps it was that the horse's nostrils flared as if smelling some old kin. He stepped closer and the stallion's eye shifted, not in anger but in a wary gauge, the way a creature weighs a stranger's scent. Would the wild thing know he was one without hands at the council table? A man named Hargreaves, broad-shouldered, narrow-eyed, a keeper of dogs and grudges, made a motion to secure the horse more tightly. "He belongs to no man," Hargreaves said, "and so he belongs to the rope." His voice was the sort the magistrate liked. It needed no proof. The townmen murmured assent. They had reasons. Crops trampled, a child's cart spooked, the magistrate's mare found with a fright that would not lift. The ledger weighed in favor of swift order. To the boy it sounded like a sentence struck into the air. But the boy had a thing inside him that would not let the stallion's breath be counted as merely a tally. He crept close and by habit more than design put out his palm to the horse's flank. The stallion twitched his hide and pinned his ears but did not throw his head. He smelled of winter and river mud and blood. The boy's palm rested, knowing the language of quiet. He did not name himself. He offered salt from a pocket, a trick he had learned that calms a wary mouth. The stallion licked. His teeth were yellowed like the bones the boy had sometimes found by the ford. Word spread like the flicker of dry paper. The magistrate called for a vote at dawn, and the town would come to mark the hour. Hargreaves grinned. He smelled reward in a thing that could be declared dangerous. The boy stayed. He was not the sort to voice a plea, and yet he would not leave the beast to the rope and to morning's knife. That night a storm gathered like a beast itself, low, threatening. Rain began to sheet, and the orchard turned its leaves into hands that washed the lamps. Men argued under the magistrate's lamp about the cost of mercy and the weight of precedent. The boy listened and felt the storm press the town's faces into their truest lines. He could no longer pretend he watched from the outside. He had become a small knotted part of the web. A complication came with the storm. A mare near the eastern hedge foaled in panic, and the village's only ostler sprained his ankle trying to calm her. The magistrate called that misfortune a sign. Hargreaves called it confirmation. Yet another voice rose, a woman named Maeve, who kept bees and had a mouth like a bell. She had once seen more of the wild than she would tell. "We must not be quick," she said in a voice that tasted of honey and smoke. "There are things a rope cannot truly bind." Her words fell like small stones. The magistrate frowned. He was a man who measured sound in gold. Still his quill paused, and the pause allowed the boy to move. Sparrow, for so the boy's feet named him in the hush, stole back that night beneath the thunder. He carried with him a rope knotted from a scrap he had kept, and the horseshoe he would not lose. The rain sent the town to its eaves. The orchard became a corridor of shaking silver. He approached the stallion when the men's backs were turned, and when the magistrate had gone to confer with the churchwarden. The stallion's breath steamed. His eyes were wide as cathedral ceilings. His body quivered like a bell rope struck. The boy spoke nothing. He moved with the old learned gestures, the palm low, the voice a half whistle. He remembered how once he had calmed a chestnut foal by the riverbank. A steadying murmur, the offering of the salt on the tongue, the crawl of a hand along the shoulder that said, "I mean you no harm." The stallion's ears pivoted. He lowered his head just slightly, an old horse gesture that reads as trust among beasts, yet not yet a pledge. As the boy worked to loosen the chain, a sudden sound, a dog's bark sharp as a thrown spear, alarmed them. A lantern swung. Boots banged. Men tumbled from their beds. The boy froze, half within the reach of rope and half without the safety of shadow. The stallion shifted and reared. That movement flung the boy aside and scraped his palm on the stone. Pain put out a flare of alarm inside him, but he did not cry. He crawled and found purchase, and at last the chain gave with a metallic complaint that seemed to usurp the thunder. The stallion stepped free as a rumor that cannot be recalled. For a heartbeat, the two, the abandoned boy and the freed wild, stood facing each other in the downpour as if the world had narrowed to their breath. But salvation is seldom quiet. A torch burst through the orchard, and Hargreaves's voice cleaved the storm. "There, he flees!" Men surged. Dogs strained. The town had one path forward: catch the stallion and end the debate the magistrate had settled upon. The boy gripped the stallion's mane, not to bind but to steady, and felt the animal's muscles knot like coiled ropes under his fingers. He could have fled then, slipped into the wood with the beast and left the argument to rot in men's mouths. Instead, he stayed. Perhaps he stayed because the horse shivered and looked at him with an intelligence that was not merely animal, but nearly human in its plea. Perhaps he stayed because the locket at his chest burned with the urge of a name half remembered. Would the town watch a boy and a beast escape them both, or would they tighten the circle until nothing but ruin remained? The turning point arrived not by act of strength but by the discovery of a mark. As the boy wrestled with the animal's flank, the lantern scratch of light revealed a brand beneath the stallion's hair, a crescent precisely like the hammer mark upon the horseshoe in the boy's pocket, a white moon of scar that sat like punctuation on the animal's shoulder. The boy's fingers, slick with rain, brushed it. Memory, sudden, violent as a bell, unslid through him. The locket's hinge caught the light. He remembered a stable, a man's hands, the smell of tobacco and pity. He remembered a night when the roof had fallen and a woman had placed something about his throat and told him a name he could not yet hear. The brand was an answer and an accusation. Who had marked the stallion thus? And why did that same crescent echo in the boy's found things? Before he could think the thought whole, the magistrate's men closed in. What they saw at that moment, the matching crescents, the boy's wet hand on the animal's side, would not be the last surprise, but it would be the one to rip open the next chapter. The orchard held its breath as if the heavens themselves had leaned nearer to hear what men might do to Mercy. Lanterns doubled like small suns. The town's men formed a rough semicircle of shadow and accusation. Hargreaves's voice, fat with certainty, named the boy a thief, a meddler in matters not his kin. "Bind him," cried one. "Hang him if he speaks false," urged another. The magistrate, whose face had grown an animate ledger of public duty, stepped forward with a quill-shaped finger ready to mark the child into law. The stallion stood with rain upon his flank, his coat dark as a pond under moon, his breath steaming in the orchard's chill. His eyes were twin wells reflecting the torchlight, and in them the boy read a plea not for escape but for truth. The boy's hand found the brand again, as if the crescent itself had become an emblem of destiny. The matching mark on the stallion's shoulder had been discovery. Now it was accusation. Why had the same crescent been hammered into beast and kept in the dirt as a horseshoe, later to be found by the boy's toe? The town's voices rose like a gale. Men who had once thrown bread to the poor now sharpened their tongues into spears. The magistrate's men pressed closer, boots biting into softened earth. Dogs already eager for the hunt whined and circled, their noses working the rain-slick air for a scent to pin. In that moment, the boy could have backed into shadow, let the law do its slow work, allowed the stallion to be judged by men who counted worth in coin and convenience. Yet within him a different law moved, an instinct old as sky which said that kin, blood, or scar must answer to one another, not to ledgers. He locked his fingers within the stallion's mane, fingers finding purchase in the coarse rope of hair, feeling the muscle roll like a tide beneath. The horse trembled, high-lifted and tense. He snorted, a steam speech that smelled of riverstone. The boy's palm lay flat against the warm flank, steady as a prayer. Hargreaves lunged. He would seize the creature by halter or by bridle or by bone, and do the town's work with the blunt edge of a man convinced of his rightness. The stallion reared, an arc of strength, white teeth bared, the toes of his hind feet flashing like the last flare of a struck bell. Men yelled as the animal sought to unseat the hand that held him and the rope that bound him, to be rid of the company that had decided his death. A dog leapt. A rope snapped. For a breath, chaos swept the orchard. Lanterns tipped and guttered. A man fell and cursed. The magistrate's ink-stained hand trembled on his quill. Then, like a thunderclap, everything slowed to the cadence of a heart about to break. The boy wrapped his arms around the stallion's neck, not as one who would master, but as one who would anchor. He pressed his cheek to the horse's halter and felt the beat of a giant heart beneath smaller ribs. The stallion lowered his head, an enormous patient bow, and pressed into the boy as if choosing him from all the world's noise. In that single gesture, the horse offered trust with the gravity of a covenant. He did not flee nor strike. He stood as a king choosing a beggar for counsel. A voice cried out, "See, he leads him as his own." This was what the magistrate had feared. The town's book of laws, so tidy and so small, could not account for a bond that crossed the margins. Men shifted uneasily. The ledger made no room for such things. Hargreaves's face, now raw with anger, twisted into a plan to seize both boy and beast and present them as proof that law was necessary. He lunged forward with a net, a crude thing of hemp and mockery aimed to snare the stallion's haunch. The net fell like a clumsy moon over the animal. The stallion kicked, an explosive measured strike, and the net burst with a sound like wood breaking. Men shouted. The boy was thrown to his knees. And then the stallion did a thing that would be spoken of long after the magistrate's ledger was dust. He reached a forehoof down and, with the gentlest of inclinations, nudged the boy as if to say, "Arise." The gesture, simple and sublime, cut through the orchard's tension like a sword of light. To the crowd it looked like defiance. To those who knew horses it was the noblest of equine acts, a sign of acceptance, of partnership. The animal's nostrils flared. He folded his ears back not in malice but in concentration, and he stamped 1 foot 3 quiet times, a rhythm that seemed to speak of storms weathered and of a pact made heavy as winter. The magistrate, his countenance a map of worry, declared the boy arrested for theft and for leading off a beast marked by the commons. Hargreaves called for tarrying. He wanted the beast's brand verified and the boy's lineage discovered, so the town could fit both into tidy boxes. As the men reached, a voice rose from the edge of the clearing. Maeve, the beekeeper, whose palms were as rough as combs and whose patience had the length of winter roads. "Stay your hands," she said. "Mark not only the brand but the story under it." Her words were a pause that the magistrate could not easily ignore. She had in the past seen things men preferred not to see. Moved by sudden obstinacy or by a whisper of curiosity, the magistrate bade them bring the ledger and any records of brands. They searched the stables, the old register where once a keeper of horses had tallied names and marks, and they found beneath dust and worm-eaten pages a record kept by a man now dead, a list of beasts once lost or stolen during a season of burning and sick. Beside a faded entry, No. 37, Black Stallion, branded crescent lost in the fire of Eversummer, was a name. The same surname the boy had once heard in a memory that was not fully his. A chill ran through the assembly. The magistrate's voice faltered as a reed. The boy's locket, cold against his skin, swung and struck his breast. In that oscillation, memory peeled back a layer. He saw not fully the face of a woman whose hands had been both rough and gentle, setting a brand in mitigation against some darker make. Chaos reformed into a net of questions. The magistrate demanded that the boy and stallion be taken to the hall at once, as proof that the town would not be overthrown by sentiment. The crowd followed, torchlight like a wave. The stallion walked with the boy at his shoulder as if escorting him to a throne. Whispers trailed them. The brand matched. The ledger agreed. The boy's locket told of a shelter once given and then withdrawn. Yet some among the crowd hardened into judges who would find any cause to condemn difference. The stallion tossed his head once, and in that motion the boy noticed a small ribbon of color tied within the mane. A scrap, faded, blue as river ice. It was the same color as the ribbon on the locket when the boy first found it years ago. How had it ended in the animal's hair? There, under torch and rain, the orchard transformed into a tribunal of fate. At the hall's great door, the magistrate raised his hand and bade silence. He would pass sentence on the beast and on the boy who had freed him. The town had to be taught that bonds could not replace law. The magistrate's quill hovered like a hawk. The stallion planted his feet, and in that planting the boy heard a sound like destiny creaking into place. The animal leaned his massive head against the boy's shoulder and breathed out warmth. Men shifted. Some wept in secret. Others ground their teeth into the grain of inevitable things. The decisive blow was upon them. Would the law sever them, or would some deeper reckoning alter the course of the town's small justice? What followed was less a battle of arms than a war of names. The magistrate unrolled from chest a page of old parchment, brittle as last year's leaf, wherein were inscribed the names of those who, in a past season of fire and mischief, had sought to save beasts from flames and from men's greed. There in the mush of ink and thumbprints the boy's mother's name, or the name that had been upon the locket, appeared like a ghost walking in today. She had been called a helper, a keeper of strays, a woman who held horses at the risk of being seen to harbor those not given leave by law. The record showed that during a conflagration years prior, several horses had vanished into night, their brands left only as questions. No final verdict had been reached then. Blame had been spread like a net. The magistrate read aloud, his voice thin. The brand belonged to a line of workmen and caretakers who had marked their charges for reclaiming in times of trouble. In other words, the crescent was not the mark of theft, but of refuge. The crowd hushed, the distance between doubt and comprehension narrowing like the coming of dusk. Hargreaves's jaw worked. He had stood to gain when the town's fears were fed. Now the town's ledger threatened to shift, and with it his advantage. His anger became a thing shrill as a hawk. "We are swayed by old paper," he spat. "Old paper cannot keep a beast from trampling our fields." Maeve, who had watched 100 small tragedies with the patience of someone who keeps bees through winter, stepped forward and told of a night when flames took grain and roof alike, and a woman with soot on her hands had led frightened beasts to safety, branding them to keep them distinct from the men's private herds. "We mark to remember," she said simply, "not to own." Her testimony fell like a steady rain that washed the dust from the ledger. Faces softened. The magistrate's hand trembled as he closed the book. His instincts were not wholly cruel, only clumsy with fear. The boy's cheeks were streaked with rain and mud, a child hunted and found, and the faltering light made him look smaller still and yet somehow larger, an emblem of stubborn life seeking a place to stand. Hargreaves would not be easily undone. He tugged at rumor like a rope and tried to pull the town back to its first certainty, that wild things were threats and that a loose animal meant loose morals. He dragged witnesses with tales of crops lost and of maidens frightened by a beast's night sprint. Yet each accusation found an answer in the ledger's quiet record, in Maeve's witness and in the stallion's gentle gestures. The horse, for his part, took to standing by the boy as if appointing himself guardian over a human who had none. He sometimes lifted his head and rubbed his nose across the boy's crown in the way of a father smoothing hair, an act that unmade the magistrate's premise with everyday tenderness. In the hall the magistrate convened a council not to execute but to adjudicate. Men argued. Women spoke plainly. Some left in disgust. The boy stood before the assembly with the stallion's flank at his side. The magistrate declared that the brands were worthy of investigation, not condemnation, and that no immediate sentence would be passed upon the beast. This pronouncement was small mercy, a momentary reprieve that felt to many like a miracle, to others like delay. Hargreaves cursed the uncertainty and stomped out, vowing that the matter would be watched. The town dispersed with talk like moths over a lamp, drawn, unsure, and not wholly calmed. In the days that followed, the town's pace slowed into an unfamiliar rhythm. They watched the boy and the stallion with a fierce curiosity that at times softened into admiration. The pair became a kind of answer to prayers none had dared voice, the animal that would not be tamed by cruelty, the child who would not be tamed by scorn. The boy worked among men who had once called him Sparrow, helping patch fences and clear ditches. The stallion helped too, not by harness nor by yoke, but by patience and presence, calming nervous mares and guiding cart horses past hedges. In these small acts, the town began, reluctantly, to learn a lesson of reciprocity. The boy's memory returned in pieces. He dreamed one night of a stable roof that had sung under rain, and of a woman who crooned to frightened animals in a voice like a reed. He saw again the blue ribbon, the scent of lavender, the hand that had slipped the locket about his throat and said a name he had not kept. He found in a pocket of the magistrate's ledger left unguarded a note, blurred but legible enough, where the woman's signature sat beside a list of animals taken in during the fire. The name matched the locket's faint engraving. He took the paper to Maeve, who read it by lamplight and nodded as one who confirms an old truth. The boy's chest hollowed and filled. The wound that had driven him into silence loosened by a thread. He was not simply a foundling. He was the kin of someone once called to mercy and punished for it. Yet the town was not cured of fear. Hargreaves's threats lingered like storm clouds. He set traps within hedges, sharpened hooks to catch hoof, and spread tales in taverns that the stallion would one day lead the poor to revolt. The boy felt these barbs as if they preyed upon his own skin. Still, he had the stallion, whose temper leaned toward the dignified rather than the feral. The horse would perform in private small solemn acts of rescue, nudging a trapped lamb from a ditch, resting a muzzle on a crying child's shoulder, stamping a hoof twice to warn of sinking ground. In such moments the town's heart softened and the ledger's rigid lines blurred into the welcome stain of human feeling. Time, that slow and honest judge, performed what decree could not. The magistrate, who had not wished for trouble but who had feared chaos more, declared that the stallion was to be placed under a town keeper, not for execution, but for oversight. A compromise that would allow both law and mercy their measure. The appointed keeper was old Tom, whose hands had learned the smell of feed and the shape of a hoof. He had once known the boy's mother by name and remembered her gentleness. Under Tom's watch, the stallion was fed with care. More than that, he was given space to be what he was, not a beast to break nor a danger to dull. The boy, who had no formal right to the creature, was given a small half-stall in Tom's care where he might tend and learn. It was not adoption in a legal sense. It was something truer, a sharing of shelter and purpose that mended both a child's hunger and a horse's wary solitude. Over the months, the town's fear changed its shape. Where once men had brought torches and rope, now they brought words of thanks, soft and awkward as newly baked bread. The stallion's presence turned into a slow teaching. He stood calmly when the magistrate's mare neighed in alarm. He walked with the cart horses and taught them steadiness by example. He allowed himself to be brushed by children whose hands trembled with wonder. The boy's hands grew sure. His small rituals became craft. He learned to shoe the animals, to pare a hoof so it rang true, and to read the subtle language of ear and throat and flank that horses speak to one another. The ribbon in the stallion's mane faded from blue to the pale of old sky. The locket warmed against the boy's chest, and its hinge grew less eager to fall open. In the quiet of an evening when the orchard's air held the soft rustle of summer's end, the stallion did a thing that would pay back the story's debts with surplus grace. He led the boy to the hollow where the river runs slow, and there, beneath a leaning willow, the horse scraped the earth with his nose and unearthed a small wooden box wrapped in oilskin. Within it lay a bundle of letters, dry as leaves, folded like secrets. The boy opened the first with hands that moved like the turning of pages in a book of prophecies. The handwriting was rough but loving. The letters spoke of a woman who had hidden animals in the night and had marked them with a crescent to keep them safe, of a promise made to a child in a storm and a locket placed about a small throat to remember a name. Each line washed the boy in a sad, bright light. He was not the orphan of chance, but the child of someone who had chosen mercy and borne the cost. The box's final letter bore a line that struck through the boy's memory like a bell. "If the world asks of thee what you will give," the woman had written, "give the small and stubborn thing of mercy. Bind not to law, but to kindness. The rest will follow." Tears fell from the boy's eyes as if a gate had unlatched and the river of his youth poured forth. He held the locket, now opened, and found within a strand of hair the color of smoke and a pressed sprig of lavender. The stallion pressed his forehead to the boy's shoulder then, and together they stood with the willow overhead as if an old hand had smoothed their hair. The town witnessed the slow completion of their own arc. Those who feared the boy now nodded in passing. Those who had sharpened their opinions now found themselves softening in the face of daily kindnesses. Hargreaves, stubborn as a stone, left the town some months later for another parish, taking with him the bitter taste of a war he had not won. He spoke in taverns of ruined certainties and warned other towns of loose animals. Yet in Ashford, the memory of torches had been outshone by routines of care. The magistrate kept his ledger but added in a hand that had grown gentler a small note beside the entry for the stallion. Under watch, kindness recommended. It was not the law transformed wholly, nor was it a surrender. It was the wiser work of compromise that keeps a village from breaking. On a morning that saw the orchard wearing frost like a fine veil, the boy, no longer only Sparrow but a child who could speak his name aloud when asked, led the stallion down the lane. Children followed, their breath silver in the cold, and women brought scraps of cloth to tie in the animal's mane as a jest and a gift. The horse walked slow and proud, his hooves ringing like a metronome that measures small patient victories. He dipped his head at a child's timid touch, nuzzled a farmer whose hands once hurled stones, and then, in a moment of completion so quietly fierce it stole breath, he turned his head and regarded the boy as one man regards another, who has done what must be done. The boy lifted his face, and in the horse's eye read a mirror, no longer an orphan of fate, but a keeper of mercy. The final image that would seed every telling was simple. The stallion leading the boy up a small rise, the town behind like a book laid open, pages turned by gentle hands. The wind lifted the boy's hair. The locket glinted, and the crescent brand on the horse's shoulder showed white against dark. It was as if the world had finally, reluctantly learned the grammar of compassion. The boy understood then that daring is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet refusal to let cruelty be normal. The horse had not been saved by law nor by might, but by the singular daring of a child who moved between mercy and fear, who reached into a stallion's mane and found a covenant. And so the story narrowed into a last, sweet echo, a line to linger. The boy and the stallion walked on, two ragged hearts bound by the strange geometry of grace as the town behind them, wiser, turned to its day. If this tale moved thy soul, subscribe and press the bell, that thou mayest join us anon for more stories where small courage alters the world. And if thy heart is stirred, leave a word below. Tell us which line lingered within thee, that others too may find the light.